Christmas night in the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico was quiet and peaceful. The streets were empty, sparkling with holiday lights, and people were enjoying the festivities with loved ones. But behind the walls of an ordinary house in a suburban neighborhood, something was happening that would soon change one family's life forever. Maria Rodriguez, a 34-year-old wife and mother of two, disappeared without a trace. Her absence was noticed on the morning of December 26th, when neighbors, who were used to the noise and joyful shouts in her home, noticed the eerie silence. At first, it did not cause concern. Everyone was sure that she had simply gone to her relatives or visited friends. But after a few hours, her absence began to seem strange, especially when her husband, Robert Rodriguez, started acting suspiciously. Robert, a 38-year-old man known for his reserved and cold nature, was the last person to see Maria. According to him, they celebrated Christmas together as a family, after which she allegedly left the house, taking only her purse and car keys with her. Robert showed little concern even when his wife did not return by lunchtime the next day. On the questions of neighbors and relatives, he answered monotonously, "Maria left." But few believed this version. Maria was a caring mother who would not disappear without warning, especially during the holidays. On December 27, Maria's family began calling the police. Her sister, who lived in a neighboring state, had been unable to reach her since the evening of the 25th. Maria's phone was not answering, social media was inactive, and her car was parked in a spot outside her home. Police officers, upon receiving a missing persons report, immediately began investigating. The first thing they did was to arrive at the Rodriguez's home, where they were met by Robert. He remained calm, answering questions briefly but confidently. He told the same story. His wife had left the house and never returned. There were no signs of a struggle or break-in. Everything looked familiar, except that the atmosphere in the house was tense, and Robert, though he tried to appear unperturbed, could not hide his nervousness. The police officers began a tour of the house. Everything looked in place. The Christmas tree was in the corner of the living room. The presents were unwrapped, and the remains of the holiday dinner had not yet been cleared from the table. But one detail caught the detective's eye. The kitchen surface was stained with what looked like bloodstains that had clearly been attempted to be scrubbed away. In addition, the trash bags in the container outside were filled more than usual and looked strange. They were neatly packed and wrapped in several layers of polyethylene. The detectives had immediate doubts. Robert's behavior, the strange stains, and the trash bags were the first red flags. They decided to conduct a more thorough search. Robert tried to object, but his arguments were rejected. The police requested a search warrant, and by late afternoon that day, detectives began looking through every corner of the house. When they got to the garage, it was immediately obvious that something was wrong. There was an odor of chemicals in the air, as if someone had recently done a general cleaning. The floor of the garage had been cleaned, but there were still faint bloodstains on one area that had not been completely removed. In addition, there were obvious marks of something heavy on one of the walls, which could be related to an attempt to hide evidence. Detectives sent blood samples to forensics to determine its identity. The next stop was a dumpster. Officers opened the neatly packed bags and found scraps of plastic bags inside with remnants of clothing and fabrics that appeared to be drenched in blood. Some of the items belonged to Maria. They were her favorite pajamas and house slippers. But the most gruesome find was fragments of human bones and flesh, which were wrapped in thick plastic bags and tried to hide among the household garbage. This was the point of no return. It became obvious that Maria had not just disappeared, but had been brutally murdered. The remains of the body were so badly mutilated and dismembered that it was impossible to identify them immediately. But the police had no doubt. It was Maria's body. Criminalists began work at the crime scene, carefully collecting all the evidence and traces to restore the picture of what had happened. Meanwhile, Robert, realizing that the police had uncovered evidence, began to get nervous. His story that his wife had simply left home was no longer credible. The police decided to detain him for questioning. Questions about why he had not reported his wife missing earlier. why there were traces of blood in the house, and how to explain the discovery in the garbage made him aggressive. He began to get confused in his testimony and eventually fell silent when he realized that his position had become untenable. The investigation continued, and detectives began to delve into the Rodriguez's family life. At first glance, they seemed like an ordinary family. Robert worked as an engineer, Maria as a school teacher. They had 2 children, who on that fateful day were at their grandmother's house. But as relatives and acquaintances were interviewed, dark secrets of the family were revealed. Neighbors and friends described Robert as a cold and controlling husband. Maria often complained about his outbursts of anger, but always tried not to take the problems public. There were many hidden conflicts in their marriage, which Maria's friends said had escalated in recent months. She wanted to leave Robert, but feared for her safety and the children's future. Maria's relatives confirmed that she was seriously planning to file for divorce after the holidays, but was afraid of her husband's reaction. With each passing day, it became more and more obvious that Robert was involved in Maria's disappearance and death. However, concrete evidence was needed to prove his guilt in court. The police continued to collect evidence, studied correspondence between Maria and Robert, trying to reconstruct the events of that fateful night. The key moment was the analysis of the found fragments of the body. Forensics confirmed that they belonged to Maria Rodriguez. Forensic experts also determined that death was caused by multiple stab wounds inflicted with apparent brutality. Some wounds indicated that the attack was deliberate and cold-blooded. After the murder, the body was dismembered and attempted to be hidden to make it difficult to find. As the police worked to gather evidence, the interrogations continued. Robert became increasingly confused in his testimony, which made his position untenable. Eventually, the investigation gathered enough evidence to formally charge him with murder. Thus, on the first day after the holidays, a quiet Albuquerque suburb turned into the epicenter of a horrific crime that shocked not only the locals, but the entire state. Immediately after the arrest of Robert Rodriguez, detectives began to delve into the details of his life to better understand what could lead to such a brutal crime. To understand this case was not easy. Outwardly, the family seemed ordinary. They had 2 children living with their grandmother in the days when the murder occurred. However, it soon became clear that behind the facade of well-being hid deep problems that went unnoticed by most of their acquaintances. The police investigation led to the darkest corners of the relationship between Robert and Maria. Maria, according to her close friends, repeatedly voiced her dissatisfaction with the marriage. She said Robert had become increasingly aggressive and controlling, especially in recent months. Police soon discovered that her cell phone, which was found among her personal belongings, contained messages indicating her plans to divorce her husband. These messages served as one of the first key pieces of evidence in the case. While examining the family's bank accounts, investigators also noticed strange financial movements that began in the weeks before the murder. Robert was transferring significant sums into his personal accounts, which did not fit their usual family budget. He seemed to be preparing in advance to hide the money, perhaps anticipating the divorce and subsequent financial consequences. This heightened police suspicions that the crime had been carefully planned. Forensic investigators continued to examine traces of blood in the house. Stains found in the kitchen and garage had already provided enough evidence for experts to conclude that Maria had been killed there. A closer inspection showed that the blood on the kitchen floor and in the garage had not been completely washed away. Marks in hard-to-reach places gave away Robert's attempts to cover his tracks. Forensic experts used luminol to check for hidden traces of blood, and the results confirmed the hypothesis that part of the dismemberment of the body took place in the garage, after which the fragments were neatly packed and put in the garbage. At the same time, the police studied the video footage from surveillance cameras installed in the neighborhood. Although Robert claimed that he had not left the house on the night of the murder, analysis of the camera footage showed otherwise. The footage from one of the cameras, installed near a dumpster, showed the shadow of a man carrying out packages on the night of December 26th. The time recorded on the cameras coincided with the interval when investigators believed Robert was disposing of the evidence. The evidence was beginning to add up. Maria's correspondence, Robert's financial manipulations, The camera footage and the blood evidence all pointed to the murder being premeditated and cold-bloodedly planned. However, this was not enough to be completely certain in a court of law. Investigators realized that they needed additional evidence that would link Robert to the murder without a doubt. Police attention was also drawn to the behavior of the children, who were at their grandmother's house at the time of the murder. Although the children had not witnessed the incident, detectives discovered that their trip to their grandmother's house had been arranged by Robert several days before the holidays, which also looked suspicious. Leaving the children safe, he apparently intended to see his cruel plan through to the end without fear that the children might have witnessed it. With each passing day, new evidence came to light, but not everything was so clear-cut. Robert's defense argued that the charges against him were based on guesswork and conjecture. Robert's lawyer emphasized that a direct link between him and the murder had not yet been proven, despite the circumstantial evidence that had been found. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued to examine the remains of Maria's body. Forensic experts concluded that she had been killed by several knife strokes and then her body was dismembered. This indicated that the crime had been particularly brutal, making spontaneous murder highly unlikely. At the same time, there were indications that Robert had prepared for the murder in advance, starting with the purchase of knives and cleaning chemicals weeks before the incident. Robert's psychological profile, based on his testimony and the accounts of his acquaintances, described him as a violent man who sought total control over all aspects of his life, including his family. He often displayed an overbearing nature, which Maria gradually grew increasingly disgusted with. Their relationship, in fact, had begun to crumble long before the tragedy, and the murder was the culmination of that process. The investigation also uncovered another important detail. In recent months, Maria had entered into a close relationship with a work colleague. This came to light through correspondence on her cell phone. For Robert, who was obsessed with controlling the family, this could have been the last straw that provoked him to murder. The police considered this version as one of the possible motives for the crime, especially since Maria had already discussed with a coworker the possibility of breaking up with Robert and starting a new life. As the investigation moved toward its final stages, detectives received an important new witness statement. It turned out that one of Maria's friends, with whom she had shared her worries, knew of Maria's intentions to leave Robert. She said that Maria was afraid of her husband's aggressive reaction if she informed him of her decision and put off this conversation until after the holidays. This heightened suspicions that Robert knew of her plans and decided to act without waiting for a divorce. Meanwhile, the process of forming an indictment against Robert was well underway. Key elements were the blood traces found in the house, the remains of the body, and the camera footage that proved his involvement in the murder and subsequent actions to cover up the evidence. Despite the defense attorney's attempts to portray this as a random occurrence or mistake, the evidence was too clear to ignore. While the police were finalizing the evidence, media coverage of the Rodriguez case began to spread. The crime quickly gained widespread publicity, attracting the attention of not only Albuquerque residents, but the entire country. Journalists covered the investigation, discussing possible motives for the murder and the gruesome details of the dismemberment of the body. The case soon became a topic of discussion on social media and news channels, adding pressure on investigative agencies and the judicial system. Having finalized the charges, police took the case to trial. Robert Rodriguez was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, with the aggravating factors of the brutality of the crime and attempted cover-up. His demeanor in court, as well as during interrogations, was detached and cold, and he continued to deny his guilt despite all the evidence. The trial promised to be long and complicated, as the defense was going to use every opportunity to reduce the punishment. However, the investigators were confident that they had enough evidence to get a fair sentence for the killer. Thus ended another chapter of the investigation, but the story was far from over. The investigation into the murder of Maria Rodriguez continued, delving into aspects of the couple's lives that could shed light on the cause of the tragedy. Investigators focused on Robert and Maria's past, their relationship, and possibly ulterior motives that may have driven Robert to the brutal crime. Police began looking into all possible factors that may have led to the deterioration of relationships in the Rodriguez household. The psychological portrait of Robert, compiled on the basis of conversations with his former colleagues and acquaintances, began to take a darker shape. It turned out that this was not the first time Robert had been aggressive. Some former family friends said that they had noticed changes in his behavior for a long time. Aggressive outbursts and mood swings started to appear even before the murder, but no one thought it would go this far. A key aspect of the investigation was looking into Robert's past. Detectives discovered that he had several run-ins with the law in his youth, although his offenses were minor: fights, disorderly conduct, and vandalism. Over time, however, his behavior became increasingly aggressive and uncontrollable. Robert's psychological state in recent years also began to cause concern. At one of his old jobs, he was fired for conflicts with coworkers, but then his wife, Maria, supported him, trying to maintain stability in their family. The immersion into the Rodriguez's family life gave even more insight into the nature of their relationship. Maria, who appeared to be a cheerful and active woman, was in fact living in an atmosphere of constant stress and fear. It appeared that Robert was increasingly controlling her life, from the little things, such as restricting her socializing with friends and controlling her spending, to completely dominating her family decisions. Their marriage, which looked prosperous on the surface, was actually on the verge of collapse. Maria's acquaintances recalled her complaining that Robert was becoming increasingly aggressive, especially when it came to finances. It was not customary to discuss personal problems in the Rodriguez household, and Maria tried to keep a low profile, even as her husband's aggression escalated into physical violence. Investigators learned that in the last months before the murder, Maria had contacted a divorce lawyer, although she never decided to start the process officially. She feared the divorce would cause Robert to erupt into an outburst of uncontrollable anger, which is what eventually happened. While detectives continued to investigate the family's past, forensic experts finished analyzing the evidence found at the crime scene. Forensic evidence confirmed that the dismemberment of Maria's body was done with several sharp tools that were later found in the garage. Micro blood particles were found on one of the knives found among Robert's personal belongings, which served as further evidence of his guilt. Meanwhile, investigators also began to look into the financial situation of the Rodriguezes in more detail. It turned out that the family had accumulated significant debts, and Robert's financial situation was much worse than he wanted to admit. Much of their money went into trying to maintain the appearance of a prosperous life, and Robert seemed to be trying to hide this from Maria. The spending he was doing behind her back was only adding to their debts. The family's credit cards were maxed out, and the mortgage payments were becoming increasingly unsustainable. Time spent trying to find a solution to their financial problems led to tension between the couple. It soon became clear that Robert could no longer handle the pressure, and his aggression only increased. The connection between the family's deteriorating financial situation and Maria's plans for divorce attracted particular attention from the police. Experts believed that this could have been the catalyst for the murder. Robert, seeing that his life was falling apart, not only financially but also on a personal level, decided that he could not allow Maria to leave. The threats of financial ruin and possible divorce were becoming unbearable for him. All of this, investigators believe, may have led to his decision to kill his wife to eliminate all the problems at once. Along with these discoveries, investigators began to analyze Robert's relationship with his colleagues and entourage. It turned out that he had also recently been experiencing problems at work. His superiors and co-workers said he had become increasingly withdrawn and irritable, causing tension in his workplace. Some co-workers also recalled that Robert repeatedly expressed his dissatisfaction with life and talked about how he was fed up with everything. This was another signal to investigators that Robert's emotional state was deteriorating dramatically the night before the tragedy. As detectives continued to gather evidence, a new circumstance gave the case an unexpected twist. One of Robert's former friends reported that a few days before the murder, he had heard him make strange remarks about the future and that everything would change for the better. This information raised even more questions, as it seemed that Robert had been thinking about a murder plan in advance. The investigation suggested that he may have been preparing for the crime long before Christmas, but the motives remained unclear. A psychological evaluation, conducted at the request of the police, also confirmed that Robert was in a state of deep stress and depression. However, this could not justify his actions. The experts concluded that the crime was premeditated and carefully planned. Robert was ready to kill his wife, despite the brutality of his actions. By the end of the investigation, it was clear that Mary's murder was the result of many factors: financial difficulties, fear of losing control of the situation, and Robert's emotional instability. All of these elements came together to form a cohesive whole that led to the fatal outcome. The investigation into the murder of Maria Rodriguez, which began on Christmas night 2021, was nearing its conclusion. The entire picture of the crime was becoming clearer and clearer to investigators, but the final conclusions still needed to be confirmed. The most important task for New Mexico police was to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to bring the case to trial and secure the conviction of Robert Rodriguez, the husband who murdered and dismembered his wife in cold blood on one of the most familial and peaceful holidays of the year. Over the past months, investigators have delved into every detail of the Rodriguez family's life, reconstructed the events of that terrible night, and examined Robert's motives and psychological state. Questions remained, but the answers gradually began to form a clear picture. The financial side of the case turned out to be the key to understanding the motives of the crime. As investigators found out, the Rodriguez family was on the verge of financial collapse. Robert, who tried to maintain the appearance of prosperity, faced heavy debts, hiding it from his wife. An analysis of his bank accounts showed that on the eve of the tragedy, he had made several large transactions that looked suspicious. What the money had been spent on remained a mystery. But one thing was clear: finances played a significant role in escalating his stress and possibly prompting the murder. Investigators also discovered that Robert was in serious conflict with one of his business partners. Their joint project, involving a small construction business in Albuquerque, had fallen through, and Robert was being pinned with a significant amount of debt. In the phone records, which were obtained through the warrant, Robert is heard discussing the situation with his partner and mentioning imminent changes, hinting at some drastic action. However, the most important discovery was made when detectives examined Robert's recent emails and correspondence. In several messages sent in the week before the murder, he wrote to his attorney about bankruptcy options and the legal ramifications of divorce. This was key evidence indicating that Robert had a serious fear of financial ruin and realized that Mary might have left him, especially after she began to inquire about her rights to property in the event of a divorce. Robert's psychological condition was another important part of the investigation. Forensic psychologists who studied his behavior and history concluded that he suffered from serious anger management problems and narcissistic tendencies. He always wanted to be the center of attention, control everything and everyone around him, and could not accept the idea that his life was spiraling out of control. Maria, being a woman of strong character, began to gradually step out of that control. She began to show independence, began to make her own decisions that were not always in line with her husband's wishes. This process apparently put a lot of pressure on Robert. He could not allow his wife to leave him, especially given their shared financial dependence and debts. Experts have also noted that Robert, despite appearing calm and polite in public, had an explosive temper. His ability to hide his true emotions made him dangerous in moments of stress, especially when his world was crumbling before his eyes. Psychological expertise revealed in him signs of sociopathic behavior, which could explain his cruelty and cold planning of murder. Investigators reconstructed in detail the day Maria was murdered. Based on witness statements, CCTV footage, and phone analysis, the picture became clear. On Christmas Eve, Robert and Maria, as usual, went to the house of her parents, where they spent a few hours at the festive table. Nothing portended trouble. They laughed, took family photos, and congratulated relatives. When they returned home late in the afternoon, Maria began hanging Christmas decorations. This custom was important to her, as she always tried to create a cozy and festive atmosphere for her family. Robert, on the other hand, as the cameras in the neighboring houses showed, spent a few minutes outside, smoking away. His face was somber and he avoided talking. Once they returned to the house, according to neighbors, there was screaming. Detectives believe that at this point, Robert began to voice his displeasure about their financial situation. An argument ensued, and things soon escalated to a new level. He lashed out at Maria with his fists. During the investigation, it became known that Robert had prepared for the murder in advance. In the garage were found tools that were later used to dismember Maria's body, as well as clean garbage bags bought the day before. This proved the premeditation of his actions. Perhaps he did not plan to kill her that evening, but the quarrel turned into an act of uncontrolled aggression. Forensic experts determined that death was caused by strangulation. Maria desperately fought for her life, but the forces were unequal. After she stopped resisting, Robert proceeded to dismember the body, which took several hours. After killing and dismembering the body, Robert began to dispose of the evidence. Over the next 2 days, he slowly and methodically removed parts of Maria's body in different directions away from their home, trying to do so discreetly. The police did not receive any reports of suspicious activity or sounds in the neighborhood, allowing Robert to proceed without much hindrance. Investigators were able to determine that he was dumping body parts along the road leading to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Surveillance cameras recorded his vehicle at the exit of the town early the morning after Christmas, which became one of the key pieces of evidence in the case. A thorough examination of Robert's car revealed blood and fiber residue that matched Maria's DNA. Despite attempts to clean the interior of the car, forensics found evidence of the crime, which conclusively established Robert's guilt. After gathering enough evidence, police arrested Robert Rodriguez a few weeks after the murder. In interrogations, he initially denied involvement, but under the pressure of the evidence, his line of defense began to weaken. He tried to attribute his actions to financial hardship and stress, although this did not serve to justify the brutality with which he massacred his wife. The New Mexico prosecutor's office filed charges of first-degree premeditated murder as well as withholding evidence. The trial promised to be long and complicated, as defense attorneys built their line on Robert's mental state. However, detectives and prosecutors were confident that the evidence gathered would leave no chance of acquittal. Against the backdrop of the upcoming trial, investigators continued to explore possible additional motives. The testimony of acquaintances and family friends, who increasingly recalled that the problems in the Rodriguez's marriage were much deeper than they appeared at first glance, could play an important role in the trial. The murder of Maria Rodriguez on Christmas night was one of the most brutal crimes to rock a small town in New Mexico. The locals could not believe for a long time that such a tragedy could unfold in such a seemingly prosperous family. However, as the investigation showed, behind the external facade hid cruelty, manipulation, and deep personal conflicts, which ultimately led to a fatal outcome. The story of the Rodriguez family ended in the dock, but questions about what could have prevented such cruelty remain unanswered.